Take a close look at the presser foot that I have on this machine. This is what's called a roller foot. It's got little rollers front and back. I use this foot when I'm working with very, very thin nylons or slippery fabrics like sil nylon, because what I find is that it feeds the fabric through the machine at a very constant rate. The roller foot allows the whole unit to go through in one piece, and there's very, very little stretch to it. There's a lot of mystique about what is called the flat felt seam. You're a good 2 steps ahead of the game because you already know a lot about how to do this. The flat felt seam is a variation of the folded seam that was introduced a few videos ago. I've already put down the first stitch line. With a flat felt seam, because it can be so bulky, you go through and you cut off one of the seam allowance sides. Fold the seam allowances just like the folded seam. Now, here's where the difference comes. With a flat felt seam, open up those layers of fabric and put the seam to one side so that it lays over in one direction, keeping the fabric taut. So right down the edge of the seam. Now when you can do that on a 12-foot tarp seam, now bias tape comes in 2 styles. This is called single fold, and it just has the edges folded over and creased down. Double fold would be folded again down the center like so. I prefer the single fold, and I'll show you how I use that. Set the fabric up in the machine. You don't need to do anything to the edges because they'll all be sealed up. Set the fabric up in the machine with that bias tape and have the fabric set so it runs down the middle of the bias tape. Then, working slowly and carefully, stitch the fabric down. You want to stitch the fabric down close to the fold that's on the other side, that's underneath. And so you're going to have to guess a little bit as to where that's going to be. But that's about where you want to have it sewn. Use a fairly short stitch, particularly around corners. And start with the bias tape on the underside of the tarp. Once you have the bias tape stitched down on one side, then you can go along and you can fold that bias tape and run it right along, especially with very thin fabrics. You can actually see through the fabric, and you can run those edges of the bias tape right along each other. And there's the process for binding the edge of that tarp. Using a contrasting binding, that really looks. When I do a rolled hem on a tarp, I usually put down some twill tape along that edge, partly to stabilize it and partly to give it some strength. When you're doing that, you want to use a zigzag stitch that's no wider than the twill tape, and you want to use a fairly short stitch length. And you start by just stitching that twill tape down. Cut off the extra. That has given you some strength along that edge. And what you can do is you can just fold that over, and if you squish it between your fingers, you can get it lined up right along that twill tape. And then you just finish off that hem as though it was a normal folded hem.